Welcome to Represent NYC election coverage, brought to you by Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max, Executive Editor of Gotham Gazette. The 2020 presidential election has been called, and while millions of ballots are still being counted, including here in New York, Joe Biden is the president-elect and Kamala Harris the vice president-elect. And while more than half the country has been celebrating the Biden-Harris victory, President Donald Trump has not yet conceded, and he and many of his Republican party mates are in fact pursuing recounts and investigations, often spreading baseless conspiracy and fraud claims while doing so. But Joe Biden is expected to be inaugurated the 46th President of the United States on January 20th, and the Biden-Harris win, along with the Democrats keeping control of the House of Representatives and the still to be determined results of which party controls the US Senate, will have immense repercussions here in New York. Not to mention the many results of local races here in New York City and state, where the entire House delegation and state legislature were on the ballot, and many races are still to be called as absentee ballots are counted. So what does it all mean? What do we know and not know, and what are the next shoes to drop? Joining me to break it all down are Dr. Christina Greer, Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University, co-host of the FAQ NYC podcast, and of the election show on MNN, among other roles and titles she holds, and Jarrett Murphy, Executive Editor of City Limits and the co-host with me of the Max and Murphy podcast on New York politics. Thank you both for being here. So let's jump right into it. The presidential election, the results, initial reactions, big takeaways. Dr. Greer, why don't you start us off? What are some of your biggest takeaways of what we've seen here transpire in the presidential election?
Well, I'm a little bit on edge until January 20th, largely because in the history of our nation, we've always had peaceful transfers of power, and I do think that the president will ultimately leave the White House, but I don't think he'll go quickly or quietly. Somewhat disappointed, but not surprised at Republicans who are refusing to acknowledge that Joe Biden is the president-elect, even though the state of Pennsylvania and Nevada have put him over the threshold of 270. So as we work through trying to figure out what a transition plan could look like, as we hopefully see Republican legislatures across sort of some battleground states acknowledge the will of the people, the president is waging, sort of baseless wars in the courts that keep getting thrown out. I'm sure he'll find a sympathetic judge somewhere. But I think what's most damaging is the war that he's waging with the media, sort of rallying up his base to make them feel as though this is an illegitimate and stolen election. I think the big difference is in 2016, when Democrats were quite disappointed with the outcome of the election, they knitted some pink hats and marched in cities across the country. In 2020, with Republicans who were disappointed with the results of the election, they're putting on AR-15s and threatening poll counters and poll workers. So I think we're in a very different climate than we were 4 years ago, largely due to the president and his rhetoric.
Jarrett, what do you think?
Well, I think, it's like there are the stages of grief, like anger and denial and stuff. And I think many of us have been in sort of the flip side of that over the past several days, which is various stages of reaction to the results on the 3rd. First, some surprise that they were as close as they were, given what pre-election polls had indicated, given what some of our instincts are, perhaps distorted instincts because of our living in the bubble of New York City and New York State. But then you draw back and you say, looking even at the results now, with obviously, some states at this point still not finalizing their counts, you do see an electoral map that has changed since last time in some significant ways. Possibility of Arizona going blue, obviously a lot of talk about the blue wall in the Rust Belt states, the upper Midwest, and of course some question about where some of the southern states will end up. So I find that to be interesting and really maybe the longer term story or the bigger development of the election, since I think many of us expected Biden to win, the extent to which that map has been reshaped and whether the margins, which were fairly close, indicate any kind of long-term beachhead there or a resumption of control for Democrats. I think that's obviously something people are talking about. What I've detected in the time since then, the reaction of Republican officials is a very curious game that I think is disturbing in its own right, which is you see officials from Mitch McConnell on down, including William Barr, not exactly endorsing the president's picture of this having been a stolen election, but obviously being very careful of not wanting to completely out the president as being living in a fantasy world. I think on the one hand, that suggests that, as Christina says, we're probably not going to have a coup. We will have Joe Biden as president come January 20th. But it does indicate what I think one of the other big storylines of the election is, which is what's the shelf life of the Trump movement? And it does appear as though Republican leaders are still very afraid of him and his people and what they could do to them. And so that's why you see this very delicate tiptoeing by people not wanting to force the president to concede without obviously or too overtly endorsing his impression of what happened on November 3rd.
Yeah, I was pretty struck by when the president himself made some comments right around election day, and then the vice president spoke right after him, and really was very careful in his language. I mean, you see it from almost everyone who's trying to sort of dance around, not making their own, false and baseless conspiracy theories, but also trying to, continue to curry good favor with Trump. What do you think Joe Biden's mandate is here, Christina? What do you think, he's been tasked by the American people who voted for him to do?
Well, I mean, I think it's so interesting, Ben, because, Joe Biden's tone thus far has been one of compromise and unity, which is definitely needed. I mean, we literally have American citizens armed to the teeth walking around threatening other citizens. So that's of great import. I mean, there are obviously, we can think about infrastructure and tax breaks to New York City and how Joe Biden is going to deal with the coronavirus. His budget is going to be a moral document. And so I think that will bode well for many of us here in New York. I'm just fascinated, though, that, not surprised, fascinated, that almost 71 million people, said that they wanted to continue the course with Donald Trump. And I think that that's a really difficult needle to thread for Joe Biden to recognize that half of the voting eligible public that decided to turn out said, yes, I'm happy with children's separation and female sterilization and, the devaluing of climate change and, leaving the Paris Accord and taking native lands and having almost 250,000 Americans die on my watch and making it about me and how great I am. And a recession that we don't really talk about because I'm doing fine, which is gross incompetence. 71 million people said, I want that. I want the sort of anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim, anti-LGBT, anti-immigrant, anti-Black sentiments. I want more of that. So I think that Joe Biden in his cabinet picks, we know that he's going to try and be bipartisan as much as he can, but he's also seen that, a lot of his Republican colleagues that he's accustomed to working with over the decades long that he's been in public service, as Jarrett has alluded to, they've just gone whole hog into the Trump train. So some of them will backtrack and backpedal and pretend that they didn't do that for 4 years because they like power. And others will try and keep that memory alive because in for a penny, in for a pound, you've cast your lot with Donald Trump. And so I think the Republican Party will be fascinating just because Joe Biden is probably accustomed to dealing with the type of Republican that we have not seen in the past 4 years.
Joe Biden has to bridge a couple gaps, right? He has to bridge the gaps within his own party, and he has to bridge the gaps that Christina was just getting at between, the people, the 70 plus million that voted for him and the 70 plus million that voted for Donald Trump. Those are two pretty big balancing acts. And, for the most part, we've seen him initially talk about bridging the latter gap, the gap to the people who didn't vote for him. What do you make of, sort of the mandate that he comes in with or the task of trying to bridge those two gaps?
Yeah, well, it's quite a task. And I think the point that Professor Greer makes about Trump's increase by, I think, 4 or 5 million votes over 2016 was something I think a lot of people found shocking. Biden won a strong electoral victory and a decent sized popular vote margin, but I don't think it could be considered a landslide in any case. I think when you step back, though, if you think about what this election was about, it truly was more so than I think most elections involving an incumbent president, only a referendum on Donald Trump, like only one-dimensionally that. There were really very few other policy issues that seemed dominant. Even the pandemic seemed to be dwarfed by just this idea of you either believed in Trump or you did not. And I think that's part of the reason why the Democrats didn't do as well in lower ballot races, but we can probably talk about that later. But I think Biden understands that's what the result of November 3rd was. And so whether it was a close thing or a distant thing doesn't really matter. He won that argument. And now the bigger question is, right, how do you govern? How do you try to build a bigger, broader base of support for democratic policies? And I think that's going to probably involve, as you mentioned, Ben, some delicate navigating of his party's left and its center. I would hope that Biden has remembered the playbook from the Obama administration, which obviously he referred to quite a bit during his campaign, and the attempt that President Obama made to find common ground with Republicans to approach in a conciliatory fashion his enemies was a failure. Because they never had any intention of governing in that direction.
Right.
I think Biden is more of a Washington insider, might have some better luck cutting some of those deals, but must recognize on a strategic level that it is unlikely he's going to meet many people halfway. And so I think, he's going to have to use the power he has to achieve some wins, probably moving left and sometimes center, but I think often not with very much cooperation from the other side.
Any other thoughts on that, Christina? I mean, that seems to me, as far as I can tell, I'm not sure that Joe Biden has learned those lessons that Jarrett just referred to. It does seem like initially Biden is much more likely to think that he can come in and strike a bunch of bipartisan deals, name, people from the other party to his cabinet. And there's a lot of concern that you see already from sort of the left wing of the party. And I don't even mean the far left wing, but the left wing of the party, that he's going to turn his back on them, or not even necessarily the left wing, just the base of the party.
Right.
And
right.
questions around that. So what are you watching there?
I mean, the fact that Joe Biden's floating, Kasich or Romney, those are sort of two of the few Republicans who were left that even communicate with Democrats. I mean, I agree with Jarrett wholeheartedly. And Obama, Biden's attempts to reach across the aisle in after 2008 were an abject failure. Republicans pinky swore that they were going to make the Obama a one-term president. They weren't successful, but we see that he could barely get anything passed. And Mitch McConnell was an obstructionist, and we've only seen Republicans get worse since then. I do want to go back to something that Jarrett mentioned, which was, the diversity, the ideological diversity within the Democratic Party, because Joe Biden has to make sure, one, he doesn't try and stay so center or center right leaning, where he's, trying to make these concessions with Republicans where the base is disappointed. But also we have to recognize that the base is incredibly diverse as well. And so when we think about sort of the hardcore progressive faction within the Democratic Party, they may be the loudest, but they're actually not the majority. And so how do you keep them satisfied with recognizing, I always tell my students, a Democrat from Texas is probably more conservative oftentimes than a Republican from New York City. So what people want and how they want to get it done is going to be quite interesting to see, especially when we have to figure out who will be the Speaker of the House, since Democrats maintain control. Nancy Pelosi said in 2016 she would only serve one term, and then she re-upped, right? Mm-hmm. And so will you get someone who's just younger than Nancy Pelosi, but still has the ideology of Nancy Pelosi, thinking about Hakeem Jeffries? Or do you get someone who's actually more progressive than a Nancy Pelosi, who may be in the same age or racial demographic, but sort of represents a slightly more leftward movement of the party? And so I think that argument within the House Democrats will be fascinating. I also have been very clear and vocal, Ben and Jarrett, you both know on the podcast, even if the Democrats win Georgia and they gain majority of the Senate, I don't think Chuck Schumer is built for this moment. I think that there needs to be another Democratic senator who should be the lead. I know that lots of people, for a whole host of reasons, want him to be the lead. Some of it's symbolic, and that's incredibly important, as the first Jewish sort of head of the Senate. That is incredibly important. But I don't think that he's handled the past 4 years well as minority leader, and I think we need new leadership moving forward in the Biden administration.
We should move in. You mentioned both Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, who will undoubtedly be key players in the next Congress, whatever roles they might hold. But the idea of Joe Biden as president, Nancy Pelosi potentially as Speaker of the House again, and Chuck Schumer either as majority or minority leader of the Senate Democrats, you're very likely to see, going back to sort of a lot of what we've been discussing here, this sort of old guard of the Democratic Party that, for better and worse, believes in sort of the old Washington that doesn't seem to exist very much anymore, and that they are hoping to somehow resuscitate or convince Mitch McConnell maybe to go back to. But a lot of that will hinge on the results of these Georgia Senate runoffs, and it's just amazing that it's almost like everything with Donald Trump involved has to be some crazy roller coaster, and that control of the Senate now is part of that as well. Where
in Georgia, right?
Yeah, and we won't know which party will control the Senate until much closer to inauguration day. Is really wild. So let's talk about New York a little bit more, though. What is the Joe Biden win? And again, we just said so much of this will depend on which party controls the Senate. We know Democrats will have the House, but so much of this will depend on which party controls the Senate. But what does a Joe Biden win potentially mean for New York? Jarrett, why don't you start us off here?
Well, I think the big story in the room is obviously the pandemic and its impact on state and local governments. New York State and New York City both facing very serious budget crises. We've been staving off major cuts and major layoffs for months, kind of waiting for the feds to come in with a package. The MTA is obviously especially needy, and that's lifeblood of the city and the region. And if the feds don't come through, the state would have to step in to bail that out, with devastating consequences for the rest of the state's balance sheet. So that really is the top job, the top focus, I think. The control of the Senate weighs on that, I believe, to a great degree. But I have a feeling that I would hope that that's important enough to Biden and to Democrats writ large to help New York City, maybe not as much as we would like, but at least to help us out of the deepest depths of this crisis, that even without the Senate firmly in Democratic hands, that'd be something that Biden would find to be worth bargaining for. Obviously, now you have a lot of other states, a lot of rural areas across the country that are now in the depths of the health crisis and potentially will face some of these economic and fiscal consequences as well. So it might be that there is a broader case for action than occurred during the earlier rounds of stimulus, when it was concentrated on the coasts and in, as President Trump reminded us, Democrat cities. Now that it's a broader brush, maybe that makes it an easier argument, and allows for some horse trading. This could be a case where Joe Biden's ideological flexibility and inherent centrism, which might be problematic as he goes through his presidency, could be handy for New York in that he does know how the horse trading works. I think that would probably be the biggest hope.
Well, and it'll be interesting to see if there's anything happening in this lame duck session. If Mitch McConnell wants to try to boost the Republican candidates in Georgia in the Senate races by passing some sort of package, that'll be interesting. We shouldn't necessarily skip over that, but we are, looking ahead to when Biden is president, and the fact that, his close relationship with Andrew Cuomo, for example, could be very beneficial to New York. They go way back, and Cuomo very quickly in the Democratic primary for president just quickly tossed his hat in with Biden, and they had been close for a long time. And of course, they're also quite aligned ideologically and politically. Christina, your thoughts on the Biden presidency in New York?
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking of Biden's relationship with Cuomo and Cuomo's sort of early support for Joe Biden, and the fact that they're both centrist and know how to work with Republicans and very comfortable doing so. I also think, when we've talked about the coronavirus in passing, the fact that Joe Biden has already laid out the scientists who will help us move through this, especially as New York braces for a second and possibly even a third wave throughout the wintertime. I think that will help us have a coherent message. The fact that we'd have a president who doesn't have a disdain for cities and the immigrants and the people of color who live in those cities will obviously assist not just New York, but places like Rochester and Albany and Buffalo and Syracuse. And then, as we figure out, this will take a little bit more time, infrastructure and, relief that we'll need, especially for so many small businesses that have been hurt, not just because of coronavirus, but the recession that sort of was ushered in because of that. Thinking about how we'll structure various relief packages and tax breaks, making sure that, yet again, they don't go to large corporations who are friendly with the Trump administration, and they can actually trickle down to people who really need it, especially since the months have lingered on with coronavirus. And we're seeing a lot of Americans, especially New Yorkers, in real financial dire straits.
Right, and we've heard both Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio talk about how the top two priorities basically are a federal strategy to really, get their arms around this public health crisis, which is raging all over the country and increasing, in New York again after New York went through obviously the worst of it, and then things got quite better. Seeing some troubling signs now. but a national strategy around that. Obviously, the vaccine potential plays into that. And then number two, a federal aid package and what that could look like. And so those are the top two. But then as you're getting at there, and Jared, you've covered at City Limits, and we've done some work at Gotham Gazette, there is an enormous list of potential, funding items, policy priorities. There's federal permission for New York to implement congestion pricing that doesn't even cost any money. For example, there's affordable housing grants, so many different things that, are at stake for New York here. Some of them Biden will potentially be able to do more on his own, and some he'll need to be working with Congress to do. And again, that will come back to where the Senate lies. Going further down ballot in New York, what stuck out to you, Jarrett, as we must say, of course, that absentee ballots are still being counted, so we don't know the winners in a lot of races for the House and the state legislature. But what were some initial things that stuck out to you in New York? As we note that the results of the presidential race in New York will probably be somewhat similar to 2016, a pretty wide margin between Biden and Trump in New York City, a less wide margin, but still significant across the state.
I think that I knew, or I suspected that Biden would have fairly short coattails, but I was surprised at how short they were. Obviously, the congressional race on Staten Island, everyone knew was going to be nip and tuck. That I didn't find surprising, but the fact that there were a couple even relatively safe-seeming assembly seats where Democrats were threatened going into the last phases of the count that we're in now. Obviously, the state Senate seats on Long Island, I didn't expect all of them to end up in the jeopardy we've seen them. The Democrats' lack of success in upstate state Senate seats, the lack of success in some of the House races where marginal seats were hoped to be retained or maybe pursued by Democrats. That was surprising to me. I think that obviously this goes to the larger conversation Democrats are having about trying to do a postmortem on why they won the presidency and seem to struggle elsewhere, whether it's taking the Senate or retaining the House, loss of seats there. An internal conversation in the Democratic Party. I will just say that my impression was that, again, the focus on Trump was so all-encompassing that there really was very little else Democrats projected in the way of a message, and that allowed Republicans down ballot to highlight things like bail reform and demagogue those issues. And Democrats really didn't have much to say in response to it. And I suspect that's why we saw, Democratic success at the very top of the ticket, what mattered most, but a lot of spotty results as you move further down.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I think this was a case where all politics is local. I think also some people, may have voted for Biden because of the sheer exhaustion of the drama of the Trump presidency, waking up every morning to tweets and all caps tweets. And are we going to go to war with some adversaries abroad? So Joe Biden is a steady hand at the top of the ticket, but going to their own personal communities when people are talking about defunding the police, or they're talking about, protests that may or may not have even happened in your community, but these larger ideas that Republicans always have, not just talking points, but the follow-up talking points. And you can keep drilling down with Republicans, and they have their talking points and their messaging so concise. And we saw this in 2008. Weak talking points. 2010, hardly any at all, right? So even people who loved Obama and supported the ACA and believed that did the right thing in saving the banks and the auto industries, there's nothing that Democrats had to really hold on to. And so we saw under the Obama administration, the hundreds of state house seats that were lost and, sort of elected positions during his 8-year tenure that went to Republicans. And they slowly are coming back, but there's still not a stronghold in far too many state houses across the country. And we know that this is an important year because it's a census year, albeit truncated, but those state houses will control the redrawing of lines in the subsequent year and what that means for local politics for the next decade. So I think also that could have been something that the Democrats stressed. I don't think it's too much in the weeds, explaining to voters like what state houses do, what they'd be in control of, and why it is that this election was so important. And, we did see, Max Rose lose. That wasn't a super shock, but there were some other races across the country. I'm thinking about Lauren Underwood in Illinois, where, we could have possibly held onto that seat with some more clear messaging, especially since you knew you were going to have hyper turnout and people would be sympathetic to at least seeing a Democratic candidate.
I'm curious to see what's going to happen here in New York. Obviously, we have to see all the absentee ballots counted. And My sense is that overall, the map of House seats, the map of state Senate seats in New York is not going to be that different. I think one thing that I try to keep stressing, not only that we need to let the absentee ballots be counted, because those are going to very likely be overwhelmingly Democratic, even on Long Island and other places, not to mention Southern Brooklyn, where there's some really interesting races still to be decided. But, in 2018, Democrats won so many state Senate seats here in New York to create such a wide margin, flipping the chamber. They won several House seats that they flipped, including Max Rose, that, with a Republican president who gets out his base and is fairly popular in the party back on the top of the ticket, it seemed like this year there would be at least some, recorrection. I think, people with so much anti-Trump fervor in New York City, especially, I think got their hopes up a little bit more that, the state Senate was going to all of a sudden become a supermajority. But, there's still clearly Republican strongholds in different parts of the state, and even a few in the 5 boroughs, and even outside of Staten Island, as we're seeing in parts of Brooklyn and Queens. And so, that'll be interesting once the absentee ballots are in, but also then in our last minute or two here, just sort of the lessons and takeaways that it seems like Democrats in New York might be taking from this. I think some of that thinking might change as we see the final results. But, what does it sort of mean for Democrats moving forward here in New York to see what's happened in this election and how they might be thinking about either the upcoming mayor's race or, even looking ahead to statewide races where Governor Cuomo is going to be seeking a 4th term, for example, we all think. Christina, a closing thought or so on that?
Yeah, and I'll be brief. I think if Democrats want to be successful, they have to have a detailed articulation of what they stand for. And I understand that the Democrats are ideologically diverse, but they allowed Republicans to sort of take sort of far progressive or even, false extremist policy positions and brand them on all Democrats. So I think some of the Republican wins we saw were moderate to conservative Democrats who felt like their party was just maybe a bridge too far, even if it wasn't, right? And so I think that there needs to be, in the postmortem for the Democrats, especially in New York, who are we and how do we sort of talk about social justice issues, for example, or economic issues in a way that makes sense instead of taking Republican talking points and sort of trying to dance around. And I think that needs to be done much more clearly so that more conservative and moderate Democrats understand what the real conversation is about and not what Republicans are saying it's about.
And that conversation will definitely be part of a Max Rose district postmortem, I think, and maybe some others. Jarrett, a final couple thoughts?
I would just endorse that fully. I think that the lesson people will take might be the wrong one, which is that progressive positions make you unelectable or make the party non-competitive in marginal districts. I'm not sure that is true, but I think definitely the idea that you have to have a message built around that has to be part of a fuller set of ideas, not just something for someone else, not just something for the other. You have to speak to a broader set of needs as part of a larger agenda. That, I think, is probably the lesson that should be taken, and we'll see how that plays out with the state legislature in January and how they approach, this new term, especially with the next big race in New York being the next gubernatorial election.
So thank you, Christina and Jarrett, for joining me today, and thank you for watching Represent NYC election coverage here on MNN. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.